In the Mahabharata, the greatest epic ever composed in Sanskrit, there is a moment so precise and so brutal that scholars have argued over its meaning for 2,000 years. A man is dragged by his hair into a royal hall. Not just any man, Bhima, the second of the 5 Pandava brothers, a warrior so strong that he could uproot trees and bend iron with his bare hands. And in that hall, in front of kings and priests and his own family, he is forced to his knees. The humiliation is total. What Bhima does next is not a battle cry. It is quieter than that and far more dangerous. He makes a vow, a single unhurried promise, spoken so that everyone present could hear it clearly. Tonight you will learn what he swore, what it cost him to keep it, and why the men who heard that vow spent the rest of their lives afraid. Welcome to the story of Bhima's vow. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. The cedar pillars of Indraprasta's great Sabha rose into darkness so high that the torchlight never reached their tops. Below, the crystal floor caught every flame and threw it back doubled, amber and gold rippling underfoot like the surface of a slow river. 1,000 kings had come for the Rajasuya sacrifice, and the hall held the warmth of all of them, the smell of sandalwood oil on skin, clarified butter still drifting from the sacrificial fires outside, the faint copper edge of ceremonial ash. Somewhere near the eastern gallery, a single Veena string was plucked and then left to fade. Among those 1,000 kings, one figure stood apart without trying to. Bhima filled the entrance arch the way a lodgestone fills a room, not by movement, but by simple fact of presence. He stood with his scarred knuckles resting loose at his sides, his iron mace angled against the doorframe, and he looked out across the glittering hall with the unhurried patience of a man who has never once needed to announce himself. The dark red cotton of his dhoti was travel-creased. His gold armlets caught the torchlight and held it. He was not searching for anyone. He was simply reading the room, its distances, its edges, its people, the way a river reads a valley before deciding where to go. Around him, without a word spoken, men shifted. At the far end of that same hall, above the crystal floor and the 1,000 watching faces, Yudhishthira sat. His seat was carved teak, dark and unadorned, a plain thing for a plain man, except that no plain man had ever been asked to hold what he now held. He wore cream silk, a border of cold gold at the hem, and he sat with his hands resting open on his knees, receiving each approaching king the way still water receives a stone, fully, without resistance, letting the weight pass through him. One by one they came. One by one they bowed. Each bow pressed centuries of conquered pride into the polished floor before him. He did not smile. He did not lean forward with appetite. He simply met each man's eyes as that man rose, and something in the steadiness of his gaze made the bow feel earned rather than taken. While Yudhishthira received the kings, the four brothers held the corners. Bhima stood at the north, facing the dark arcade where the hall opened to the night air, his mace resting against his right shoulder, the iron head cool against the side of his neck. Arjuna held the east, bow in hand. Nakula and Sahadeva kept the south and west. Still unhurried, the faint smell of crushed marigold from the ceremony garlands drifting between them. They had stood in worse places together: forests, battlefields, a burning house. Nothing had split them yet. None of them said so. They simply stood, and the hall held. Not far from where the brothers stood, the women's gallery overlooked the hall through a latticed screen of carved sandalwood. Draupadi moved through it the way the hall required, straight-backed, deliberate, the deep crimson silk catching lamplight as she turned to receive each visiting queen. A woman from the Chedi court pressed her palms together and spoke some flattery about Indraprasta's beauty. Draupadi answered her warmly, and meant it, and watched her go. Then she stood still a moment. The strand of pearls at her throat was cool against her skin. The sandalwood smell of the screen, the low murmur of silk and admiration around her, all of it was real and fine and hers. She had known happiness before, but not like this, not sitting this high above the world. Something beneath her ribs tightened, just once, at the thought. Joy, this complete, asked something in return. She did not know what. She simply held both feelings, the fullness and the foreboding, and let neither one win. A ripple moved through the far end of the hall, not sound exactly, but a shift in attention, the way a crowd's weight redistributes when something worth watching arrives. Duryodhana stood at the entrance. His armor was gold-chased bronze, polished to catch every lamp in the room, and it did. He smiled at no one in particular, and at everyone at once. His eyes, though, his eyes moved differently from his mouth. They traveled the cedar pillars, the crystal floor, the ranked kings, the throne where Yudhishthira sat above them all. They paused at each thing long enough to measure it, not to admire, to price. He descended the entrance steps slowly, accepting the space the crowd made for him, and something in the set of his jaw said he was already calculating what it would cost to take all of this back. Later that night, after the ceremonies had thinned and the hall grown quiet, Duryodhana found himself alone in an inner corridor off the Sabha's eastern wing. The crystal floor caught the lamplight from above and held it, pale and rippling, so that the corridor looked flooded to the knee. Duryodhana stopped. He looked down. Then, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man preserving his dignity, he gathered the hem of his green dhoti and lifted it. From the gallery above, Draupadi saw everything. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. She tried. But the laugh escaped anyway, bright and percussive. A sound like a bronze dish struck once and set ringing, and it carried down through the carved screen and into the silent corridor below. Duryodhana's hands froze at his hem. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his face had already arranged itself into something still and unreadable. But his knuckles, gripping the folded silk, had gone pale. The laughter faded. The corridor returned to silence. Duryodhana lowered his dhoti hem with the same careful hands. He did not move from where he stood. The courtiers at the corridor's far end had heard it too. He could feel their awareness on the back of his neck, that particular stillness of men pretending not to have seen. He let them pretend. Then, very slowly, he placed one foot in front of the other and walked the length of the crystal floor. Each step landed with a soft, flat sound. He did not hurry. He did not look up at the gallery again. But something had closed in his face, the way a jaw sets after a blow, when the pain has gone quiet and only the decision remains. He had been laughed at in Indraprastha by her. He would not forgive it. Not the laughter, not the hall, not the man who had built it. This he settled in himself as he walked, the way a man settles a stone into wet ground, pressing until it holds. Shakuni had watched all of it. He stood at the hall's far edge, where the amber light barely reached, one hand resting on a cedar pillar still warm from the day's torches. He had watched Duryodhana step into the archway of that inner corridor, and he had watched him come back out. He knew that walk, the locked jaw, the careful feet. He had been waiting for precisely this kind of wound to open in his nephew. He crossed the hall now, unhurried, his right leg trailing its slight drag across the quartz. The bone-handled dice cup shifted at his hip with each step. "Come," he said when he reached Duryodhana's side. "I have something to show you." The garden alcove sat beyond the Sabha's northern wall, where the torchlight gave out and the night air came in smelling of wet jasmine and river mud from the Yamuna a quarter-mile east. Shakuni settled onto a stone bench and set the dice cup between them. "Not swords," he said. An invitation, a game of dice at Hastinapura. Duryodhana was quiet a moment. Yudhishthira cannot refuse a formal invitation without dishonor. "No," said Shakuni. "He cannot." And the game. Shakuni picked up the ivory die and turned it once between his fingers. "I have never lost." Duryodhana looked at him then, not with surprise, but with the slow recognition of a man seeing the shape of something that was already decided. He exhaled. The jasmine moved in the faint river breeze. "Send the invitation," he said. The invitation arrived within the week, and Yudhishthira accepted it as Shakuni had known he would. 3 mornings later, the Pandava chariots rolled out of Indraprasta's eastern gate onto the flat Gangetic plain, where the road to Hastinapura ran straight and pale through chest-high winter grass. The air was cold enough to see breath, the horses and the brothers both, and the dew on the chariot rails was still cold under a gripping hand. Bhima rode with his mace laid across his knees, its iron head resting against his right thigh. He watched the plain open ahead of them. A harrier crossed low over the grass, banking once, and he followed it with his eyes until it disappeared. Yudhishthira drove his own chariot steadily. Arjuna rode slightly behind, his quiver catching the low eastern light. None of them were afraid. The road was familiar, the morning clean and cold, and they were men who had never yet lost anything they could not recover. Bhima rested his left hand on the mace's grip and let the plane roll past. By the time the brothers reached the dice hall, afternoon light had already gone from the high windows. Bhima stepped through the carved doorway and stopped. The room was smaller than the sabha by half. Velvet cushions in deep saffron and indigo lined low platforms along every wall, and on each cushion sat a man watching the entrance. Not welcoming. Watching. The lamps hung too low, their heat pressing down against the back of his neck. The air smelled of sandalwood resin and warm ghee and something beneath both. Something close and held in, the smell a room acquires when many men have been waiting in it for a long time. Bhima's hands did not move to his mace. He simply stood, reading the room the way he read a battle formation. Exits, angles, wait. The courtier's eyes were careful. Too careful. Not one man met his gaze for more than a breath before looking away. He could not have named what unsettled him. Nothing had happened. The cushions were soft, the lamp steady, the floor cool stone beneath his feet. Still, something in this room had already been decided. Shakuni settled at the table before anyone else. His dice cup sat at his right elbow, carved bone, off-white, worn smooth along the rim where his thumb always rested. He lifted it without looking at it. The dice clicked inside, a dry, light sound like two pebbles knocking in a stream bed. His wrist turned. The pieces tumbled out across the dark wood, face up before they stopped roaring. He announced each loss gently. Your eastern granaries, a small thing, a pause. Your treasury horses, the northern herd, another pause. Your brother's noble Yudhishthira, all four. Each word arrived at the same unhurried pace. No triumph in them, only the patience of a man correcting an error he had already foreseen, waiting only for the student to catch up. And still Yudhishthira called for another throw. His treasury went first, the gold reserves of Indraprastha, 3 generations deep. Then the granaries Shakuni had not yet taken. Then the standing army, 40,000 men reduced to a number spoken aloud and set down on dark wood. Then the kingdom itself, every field and road and river crossing, everything the brothers had built from bare ground. He lost them all, and after each loss, his fingers straightened on the table's edge, his breathing steadied, and he said the same quiet words once more. Not from despair. That was the terrible thing. His eyes held something closer to certainty, the gambler's faith unbreakable as a bone, that the dice owed him restoration, that the next cast would correct the last, that the pattern had not finished yet. Shakuni did not smile. He simply waited, thumb resting on the bone cup's worn rim, while Yudhishthira reached again for what was already gone. Bhima had moved to the hall's edge without deciding to. He stood where the lamplight thinned, his back near the stone wall, his hands open at his sides. He had no mace. The hall forbade it, and so his palms rested against nothing. Empty, slightly curled, the scarred knuckles catching no light. From here he could see Yudhishthira's shoulders. Each loss arrived first in those shoulders, a minute settling, like timber absorbing rain. Then the quiet words. Then Shakuni's hand, unhurried, collecting. 40,000 men, a kingdom, gone in the time it takes to breathe out. Bhima breathed in, slow, measured, the way a man counts weight before he lifts it, not because it is heavy, but because he knows it will break something if he does not. Then Yudhishthira staked Nakula. The hall heard it. A breath drawn in, held, and then the dice fell with that same soft, certain knock against the wood, and Shakuni's hand moved, Sahadeva next. The same words, the same sound, Arjuna. With each name, the nearest lamps seemed to pull their light inward. Men who had been murmuring stopped. The silence did not arrive all at once. It gathered the way a room cools when a door is left open too long. Then Yudhishthira spoke Bhima's name. At the hall's edge, Bhima's fingers curled once, a slow closing of the fist, and opened again. The dice fell. Shakuni collected without speaking. He did not need to. 4 brothers. 4 throws. Each one landing clean as a stone, dropped into still water. The sound was nothing, and yet the bottom moved. Four brothers staked. 4 brothers lost. Duryodhana let that sit in the room a moment, the way a man sets down something heavy and steps back to look at what he has done. Then he spoke. "Bring her," he said. "Bring Draupadi." His messenger left at a walk, not a run. The measured pace of a man carrying words that do not need to be hurried. The assembled court did not move. Men who had watched the whole evening's work now found they could not quite bring themselves to look at one another. The oil lamps overhead burned without flickering. Even the smoke rose straight. The messenger returned without Draupadi. She had refused. Sent word back through the man that she would not come. Dushasana did not wait for another order. He crossed the floor already moving, and the hall heard his sandals strike the stone all the way to the door. When he came back, he was pulling her by the braid, not leading, not escorting, pulling. His fist knotted into that long black braid, her heels dragging the last 3 steps across the threshold, the silk of her crimson sari catching at the doorsill. Draupadi clutched the fabric at her chest and said nothing. Her jaw was set. She had stopped trying to pull free, not from surrender, from the calculation that the floor would take her down if she kept fighting, and she would not be brought down. The assembled kings did not speak. The oil lamps burned. Not one man stood. That was the silence. Not the absence of sound, the absence of a single voice that said, "Stop."
Breathe out loud.
Bhima did not move. He stood at the hall's edge and watched, and the watching cost him something he could feel in the tendons of his jaw. Then, slowly, he looked down at his hands. They were open. He had not known they were open. The knuckles had gone the color of old ivory. The skin across each ridge pulled taut over the bone beneath. He closed them. The leather-hardened skin of his palms met his fingers with a dry, papery sound that no one else heard. He opened them again, looked at them one moment longer. Then he spoke. Before every witness in this hall, his voice was low, unhurried. I will break Dushasana's arms from his body with these hands, and I will drink what runs from the wound. No one laughed. No one answered. The oil lamps burned on, as if nothing had been said. But every man within earshot had stopped breathing, because the quiet in that voice was not restraint. It was certainty. Then Bhima raised his eyes from his hands and found Duryodhana across the hall. The lamplight caught the broad plane of Bhima's face, jaw set, nostrils wide, eyes level and without heat. He spoke again, louder now, so the words could reach every corner. And Duryodhana, a pause. I will crush his thigh with my own hands, the same thigh he bared before her. I will break it, and I will be alive to do it. The court did not react with noise. Men simply went still, the particular stillness of people who understand they have heard a date, not a threat. Two kings near the eastern wall turned their faces toward the floor. A third stepped back, as if distance could separate him from what had just been spoken. These were not curses. Curses depended on the gods. This depended only on Bhima. They walked out before the sun came up. The gates of Hastinapura stood open behind them, not as a welcome, but because no one had thought to close them. The road east was gray dirt and cold air, and the 5 brothers and Draupadi moved along it in bark cloth that scratched at the skin with every step, stiff as dried leaves. Yudhishthira went first. Arjuna, then Nakula and Sahadeva, then Draupadi, her unbound hair carrying the dust of that hall still in it. Bhima walked last. The city walls rose behind him, pale limestone going gold at the very top where the first light touched. He did not turn to see it. His feet found the road ahead, and his eyes stayed on the tree line of Kamayaka forest, dark and waiting at the plain's far edge. Looking back was for men who were not yet sure. "3 days into Kamyaka, Bhima found a teak tree, old growth, trunk wider than 2 men standing chest to back, and put his shoulder against it. He did not use an axe. There were no axes. He pressed both palms flat to the bark, felt the rough surface drag against the skin of his wrists, and pushed. The roots held for a moment. Then they did not. The fall lasted 4 full seconds. The canopy tore apart above it. Green light, then white sky, then the wet percussive crash of 40 feet of hardwood meeting the forest floor. Birds burst from every tree in every direction, 1,000 wings at once, gone. Bhima stood over the fallen trunk, chest heaving, raw resin sharp in his nose, the disturbed earth smelling of wet clay and crushed fern. Something behind his eyes, something that had been pressing there since the dice hole, went quiet. He breathed out slowly. Then he bent down and began breaking branches for firewood. That night, Bhima laid the teak wood across the fire, and Draupadi sat down on the far side of it. She did not speak of the hall. She had not spoken of it since they left Hastinapura, not once, not in any form. She simply tended the fire, feeding it a branch when it dimmed, turning her face when the smoke shifted, brushing ash from her knee with one unhurried hand. Bhima watched her from across the flames. The resin in the teak hissed and popped. The forest around them smelled of damp bark and cold mud, and the faint sweetness of crushed neem leaf underfoot. He understood what her silence was. It was not surrender. It was the same thing his two hands were, something held ready, aimed at a fixed point, waiting only for time to close the distance. Two oaths, one fire. Neither of them spoke. Before the fire had burned down to coals, something moved on the path north of camp. Not animal movement, but the deliberate crash of something enormous, making no effort to be quiet. Bhima picked up the mace and walked toward it. Kermira filled the path between two sal trees, taller than a mounted man, shoulders matted with dead leaves and forest clay. He opened his mouth, and the sound that came out shook loose bark from the branches above. Bhima hit him first. For an hour they went through the forest, grappling, breaking, driving each other into trunks that split on impact. The ground churned to black mud under their feet. Bhima's palms burned where the mace grip had twisted. His knees ached from a fall over exposed root. Then the demon stopped moving. Bhima stood over him, chest heaving, mud to his elbows. The forest had gone absolutely quiet. No insects, no branch creak, nothing. His breath steadied. Something settled inside him, clean and cold and sure. He was strong enough. The vow was not a wish. It was a fact waiting to become an event. While Bhima slept, Yudhishthira sat awake at the camp's edge, back against a neem trunk, watching the fire die. He had been king. He had sat above the crystal floor while 1,000 men bowed. And then, one evening, he had picked up the dice. He turned it over now, not the ivory cube, which was Shakuni's, but the sequence of it. The first throw. The second. the moment he could have stood and did not. He pressed each decision like a bruise, not to punish himself, but because stopping felt dishonest. Draupadi's hair, his brothers' faces when their names were called. The forest made no sound. Somewhere behind him, Bhima breathed in slow, heavy pulls, the sleep of a man who had done what was necessary and closed his eyes on it. Yudhishthira could not close his eyes on it. The exile in the forest he could bear. The exile inside himself had no edge he could find. Days later, Draupadi said it only once. She had been cutting bark from a sal tree for tinder when she stopped, looked at nothing in particular, and said she had smelled a Saugandika bloom once, years before the marriage. She did not ask for one. She simply named the memory and went back to cutting. Bhima was on his feet before the words had finished settling. The Himalayan trail climbed into cold within half a day, loose shale, the kind that skids underfoot and bites the palm when you reach to catch yourself. By the second day, cloud pressed low enough to drink, and the smell changed. Gone was forest mulch, replaced by iron-gray rock and the thin bite of meltwater. His calves burned with each step's length. Gandharvas guarded the river crossing into Kubera's garden. They came with numbers and noise. Bhima answered with the mace. Beyond the crossing, the garden opened. Impossible warmth, green so bright it hurt. And there at the water's edge, a single Saugandika, pale gold petals, with white edges, stem trailing cool water, broad as both his hands. He picked it. The stem was cold and wet across his scarred knuckles. He held it carefully, more carefully than he had held the mace. The Saugandika was still in his hand when the trail leveled onto a high shelf of rock, and there, stretched across the full width of the path, lay an old monkey, gray-muzzled, eyes half-closed, tail lying flat across the stone like a fallen rope. "Move," said Bhima. "I am tired," said the monkey. "Move the tail yourself." Bhima reached down with his free hand and took hold of it. The tail was thin, loose-skinned, warm from the afternoon rock. He pulled. Nothing. He set the flower down, took the tail in both hands, and pulled again. Shoulders locked, calves driving into the stone. The tail did not shift by the width of a finger. He straightened. The monkey opened one amber eye. "Strength that has no edge," the monkey said quietly, "cannot be aimed." Bhima understood then. This was Hanuman, his own elder brother, son of the same wind god father. The tail had not resisted him. It had simply been more than force could answer. He picked up the flower. His hands were steady. Something had settled in his chest that did not feel like defeat. Then Hanuman rose, not stood, rose. The gray-muzzled body widened and lifted, fur catching the afternoon light and holding it until what filled the shelf of rock was vast and amber bright, tail curled high, eyes like hearth fire in a dark room. Bhima's knees found the stone before he decided they would. "Brother," said Hanuman. His voice was the same voice, only now it had room. "Your strength is real," he said, resting one great hand across Bhima's shoulders, warm and enormously heavy. But strength without a root beneath it breaks the one who carries it, not only the one it strikes. Bhima felt the weight of that hand in his collarbone. He did not move away from it. "Root it," said Hanuman. "Then go." The vow in Bhima's chest had not shrunk, but something had grown beneath it, quiet, wide, the way a tree's root is wider than its trunk, and never seen. After Hanuman, time moved differently. The clay lamp at the center of the forest camp was a small thing, thumb-wide base, rough-pinched lip, the kind a potter makes without thought. Bhima had found it in a village at the forest edge and carried it back without saying why. Through 3 monsoons it burned. Rain drove sideways through the camp's woven grass shelter, and Draupadi would cup her hands around the flame without touching it, leaning close until her breath itself steadied the light. Yudhishthira would sit across from her and read, lips moving faintly. Bhima would sit back from both of them, not apart but behind, where the darkness began, and hold the vow the way a man holds a coal in a wet hand, not gripping, not releasing. The lamp's oil was never sweet. It smelled of pressed sesame and damp wick fiber, and the smoke it made was thin and gray. Each year left a faint black ring inside the clay lip. 4 rings now. Bhima turned the lamp in his hands one evening, running a thumb across those rings, and said nothing. But Draupadi, across the fire, saw him do it. She did not look away. On the morning the 13th year closed, they broke camp before the mist had lifted. The road at the forest's edge was the same road they had left by. Same red laterite dust, same line of sal trees marking the plain's beginning. Bhima recognized it by the way the mist pooled in the low ground to the east, chest high, still, smelling of wet grass and the particular cold that only open country holds before sunrise. Yudhishthira looked down it for a long moment. Then he spoke of envoys, of terms, of what peace might yet be negotiated from what remained. He was not wrong to say it. Bhima knew that. Arjuna stood at Yudhishthira's left and nodded slowly. Draupadi kept her eyes on the road. Bhima said nothing. He shifted the mace to his right hand and felt its familiar pull settle through his shoulder and down into his spine. The time for speaking had ended in a hall that smelled of lamp oil and shame. What came next was not a conversation. It was a destination. That destination had a name now, Kurukshetra. The plain stretched in every direction, under a sky draining from copper to deep blue. From the ridge where Bhima stood, two cities of canvas and firelight faced each other across a quarter-mile of trampled barley stubble. Torches planted in rows so long they curved with the horizon, so many that the far edge of the field blurred into something resembling the sky above it, the stars in the fires indistinguishable at that distance. The air tasted of iron and dry dung smoke, and the specific cold that flat ground collects after sundown. Bhima unwound the linen wrap from his right wrist and wound it tighter. He could feel his pulse behind the binding. He wound the left to match. He breathed the battlefield in through his nose and held it. 13 years had passed since a hall that smelled of lamp oil and shame. He had carried the oath every day of them. Now the space between the oath and its completion had finally closed to this. One night and then morning. Morning came. Krishna raised the Panchajanya to his lips, and the sound that followed was not a note, it was a pressure, a column of air that hit the chest before the ears understood it, rolling out across Kurukshetra and flattening the dawn mist against the ground. The armies lurched forward. Bhima stood in his chariot with the mace raised above his shoulder, the iron cold in his grip despite the warmth already rising from 10,000 bodies around him. He felt the wheels begin to move beneath him. He felt the ground transmit through the axle and into his feet. 18 years. The dice hall. Draupadi's hair in Dushasana's fist. All of it arrived in one breath, and in the next breath it was simply today. The chariot wheel hit something solid and Bhima was already down, mace in hand, boots finding the churned earth. He moved forward. The soldiers of Hastinapura came in waves, on foot, on horseback, pressing from the left flank, and Bhima moved through them the way a river moves through a village, not choosing destruction, but going where it was going. The mace rose. The mace descended. The rhythm was almost slow. It was the rhythm of a man finishing a sentence he had begun 18 years before. On his right, a spear glanced off his forearm and left a hot line across the skin. He did not stop. Ahead, somewhere past the smoke and the pressed chalk dust of 10,000 sandaled feet, were two men. One who had taken a kingdom, one who had touched Draupadi's hair. Bhima kept walking. Soldiers fell away on either side, not fleeing exactly, but yielding the way grain yields before a hand. He was not angry. He was almost calm. Then he saw Dushasana. The man stood 40 paces east, knee-deep in the debris of a broken chariot, splintered wood, a snapped axle, a dead horse already stiffening in the copper and iron smell of the afternoon field. Dushasana's orange dhoti was dark at the hem. His copper armband caught the low light. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Dushasana ran. That was enough. A man does not run from what he does not remember. He ran because the hall at Hastinapura was still in him. Draupadi's hair in his fist, the sound of her knees on the floor. And he knew Bhima knew. Bhima followed at a walk, not slowly, but walking. Because he had waited 13 years, and he could wait 40 more paces. The mace was already in his right hand. The ground was broken and hot beneath his boots. Dushasana looked back once, stumbled, kept running. Bhima did not look away from him. Dushasana did not get far. Bhima brought him down in the broken ground between two shattered wheels, and what followed was not a duel. It was the completion of a debt 13 years in the keeping. The soldiers on both sides went still, not from shock, but from the recognition that something had moved past the point where witnesses could intervene. When it was done, Bhima stood. His chest moved with his breath. The mace hung at his side. Around him, the afternoon field held its silence. No clash of iron, no shouting. Only the low pull of smoke across the cleared ground and the distant moan of the battlefield carrying on without him. He raised his face to the sky, gray-white above the smoke, pale and wide and empty. Then, quietly, barely louder than his own breathing, he said her name, Draupadi. One word, not a cry, not a prayer. The way a craftsman sets down finished work and names the person who asked for it. Word reached the camp before the light changed. Draupadi was sitting outside the tent entrance, her unbound braid resting across her left shoulder when the runner arrived. He spoke quietly. She listened without moving. Then she took the braid in both hands. The women around her understood before she had done anything. One of them pressed a hand to her mouth. Another lowered her eyes to the ground. None of them spoke. Draupadi worked slowly. Her fingers separated the heavy black rope of hair at the nape, gathered it, and began to knot it upward the way it had been before the hall at Hastinapura, the way it had been before Dushasana's hand. The knot held. She pressed it once at the back of her head to test it. Then she was still. The amber light lay flat across the tent fabric. Somewhere in the camp behind her, a horse stamped once and went quiet. At the lake's edge, the water held the last of the sky, copper and dark red, perfectly still. Duryodhana was already there. He had come out of the reeds holding his mace at his side, and he did not speak when Bhima came down the bank. Neither of them did. They had been moving toward this moment for 18 years, and words had always been its furniture. The insults, the oaths, the courtroom speeches. Here there were none. Only the wet clay smell of the lakeshore, the distant creak of carrion birds settling in the trees behind them, the cold air off the water meeting the day's last warmth. They raised their maces and began. For a long time the only sound was iron striking iron and the deep exhale of effort. Bhima took a blow across his left arm that he felt in his shoulder socket. He did not stop. Duryodhana was the better technician, he always had been. But Bhima was something else. The ground shook when he swung. Then Bhima's mace found Duryodhana's thigh. The bone gave. The sound of it was flat and final. Duryodhana fell. After, the mace hung in his hand, and then it didn't. He let it fall into the shallow water at the shore's edge, and the sound it made was a low, wet thud, nothing like the sound he had imagined across 18 years. Bhima stood still. The lake had gone dark. The sky above it was the deep purple gray of an ember that has given up its heat. Behind him, somewhere far across the plain, a fire was still burning. He could smell the charred reed grass of Kurukshetra on the air, faint and dry. He lifted his hands, both of them, open, palms up, in the last of the light. The skin across his knuckles was split. His left shoulder ached where Duryodhana's mace had found the joint, a deep bone ache that would be worse by morning. His hands were enormous and scarred and very heavy. They were empty. He had carried the oath so long that he had stopped feeling its weight, the way a man stops feeling the weight of his own arm. Now it was gone, and what he felt was not lightness. It was the full measure of what the arm had cost. Bhima lowered his hands. He sat down on the cold mud of the bank, and the water came up around his feet, and he did not move. The lake held nothing now but its own dark surface. He sat beside it and let the night come in.